Breaking news, you're looking at video of one of the last times Oscar winner Gene Hackman, a known recluse in recent years.
Now with new details on the investigation into the death of actor Gene Hackman, including newly released video.
As for the inside footage, Hackman's estate wants to block that release, citing privacy.
What if the final mystery surrounding Gene Hackman had nothing to do with Hollywood, his films, or even the circumstances of his death, but with something hidden beneath the home where he spent his final years? For decades, Hackman was known as one of America's most respected actors. He played detectives, criminals, soldiers, politicians, and men caught in situations far more dangerous than they first appeared. But after retiring from acting, he chose a completely different life. Away from premieres, away from cameras, and far from the constant attention of Hollywood, he settled into a private existence in New Mexico. Then, in February 2025, everything changed. When authorities entered the secluded property following concerns about the couple's welfare, they discovered something deeply disturbing. Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, were both dead, along with their dog. Investigators would later determine that Betsy had died earlier than Hackman, leaving a troubling gap in the final days of the couple's lives. At first, the case appeared to have a tragic but understandable explanation. Officials reported no obvious evidence of foul play, and the deaths were ultimately attributed to natural causes and illness. But the property itself raised questions. The home was private, heavily secured, and surrounded by enough land to keep strangers far away. Inside, investigators encountered a scene that required a much closer examination. Areas of the house appeared disturbed. Items had been moved. A safe was reportedly open. And investigators were interested in understanding exactly what had happened inside the estate before they arrived. Then came the detail that transformed the story. According to the source material provided for this investigation, investigators discovered a concealed passage connected to the property. A tunnel, not a simple basement corridor, not an ordinary wine cellar, a hidden route descending beneath the house, concealed behind a section of the interior and apparently designed so that anyone unaware of its existence could easily miss it. Imagine standing inside an enormous private library, surrounded by shelves and books, never realizing that somewhere behind those walls was an entrance leading underground. That is where the story becomes extraordinary. The passage reportedly descended through darkness, with stone walls and a noticeably colder atmosphere. The deeper investigators went, the more unusual the construction appeared. The upper portions showed signs of later reinforcement, while deeper sections reportedly appeared much older and more primitive. And that raised the first major question. Did Gene Hackman actually build this tunnel, or did he inherit something that was already there? The source material suggests that the tunnel's construction history may have been far more complicated than a celebrity simply creating a private underground room. Some sections reportedly looked modern, while others appeared to contain older stonework and hand-carved surfaces. That distinction matters, because if the deeper structure really predated Hackman's ownership, then the mystery was no longer about something the actor had built. It was about something he had discovered, and perhaps something he had deliberately chosen to protect. The property itself was already unusually private. Hackman had withdrawn from public life after his acting career, choosing quiet surroundings over Hollywood's relentless spotlight. Yet the source material describes a level of security around the estate that went far beyond ordinary celebrity privacy. Gates, cameras, restricted access, employees who supposedly knew little about the private areas of the property. To an outsider, it could simply look like an elderly celebrity protecting his privacy. But then investigators began looking beneath the surface. According to the supplied source, the tunnel contained an underground chamber filled with old containers, documents, photographs, and unidentified objects. Some of the material was described as appearing historical, while other items seemed impossible to place immediately. There were also reported markings on the walls and patterns on the floor that were interpreted as potentially astronomical. But this is exactly where we need to separate the intriguing claims from what has actually been established. The source presents these discoveries as part of a larger mystery, but it does not provide independently verifiable evidence for many of the extraordinary details. There is no confirmed public record establishing that the FBI discovered ancient technology, secret organizations, or an impossible machine beneath Hackman's property. And that distinction is crucial, because the most fascinating mysteries are not always the ones with the wildest answers. Sometimes the real mystery is simply discovering how much of the story is fact, how much is speculation, and how much has never been publicly explained. Still, one detail from the source stands out: the possibility that the underground structure was not entirely modern. If a tunnel existed before Hackman's time, then who created it, and why? Northern New Mexico is a region with a complicated history. Beneath its mountains and mesas are mines, military facilities, laboratories, bunkers, utility networks, and other structures connected to decades of government and industrial activity. The region also has a deep association with the Manhattan Project and Cold War-era research. That doesn't prove Hackman's tunnel had any connection to classified government operations. But it does make the question more interesting. Could an older underground structure have been incorporated into a private estate decades later? Could a property owner have discovered an abandoned passage and simply decided to preserve it? Or could the tunnel have been something much more ordinary that became mysterious simply because nobody outside the property knew about it? Those possibilities are far less dramatic than a secret government network, but they're also far more realistic. And yet, the source claims investigators encountered something even stranger. According to the narrative, the underground chamber contained photographs, documents, and objects whose origins were unclear. Some photographs reportedly showed unidentified people gathered around maps and tables. Other materials were described as containing coded information. Again, these claims have not been independently established in the source. But even without accepting every extraordinary detail, there is a compelling question at the center of the story. Why would a man who spent his final years seeking privacy have a hidden underground space beneath his home? Maybe the answer is surprisingly simple. Hackman was known to be private. After decades in Hollywood, perhaps he simply wanted a place that belonged entirely to him. A secure storage area, a private archive, a reinforced shelter. People with enormous wealth sometimes construct unusual spaces simply because they can. But the timing creates another layer of intrigue. Hackman was 95 when he died. His wife had reportedly died earlier, and investigators were left reconstructing the final period of their lives without being able to ask either of them what happened. That means every locked door, every room, every document, and every unusual structure suddenly became part of the investigation. And somewhere beneath the property was a passage that most people apparently never knew existed. The deeper investigators went, according to the source, the more the tunnels seemed to change. Modern construction gave way to older-looking stone. Reinforced sections gave way to rough walls. And eventually, they reportedly reached a chamber. This chamber is where the story takes its darkest turn, because at the far end, beyond the reported storage areas, was another barrier, an iron door. The source describes it as heavily corroded, with no obvious handle from the outside, and seems that appear deliberately sealed. If that description is accurate, the question isn't simply what was behind the door. The question is why the door was built that way. Was it intended to protect valuable objects? Was it part of an old bunker? Was it simply an abandoned section of a larger underground structure? Or was the door never meant to be open at all? There's one more possibility: that the mystery has been exaggerated. The internet has a way of transforming ordinary discoveries into legendary ones, especially when a famous person is involved. A hidden room becomes a secret bunker. Old papers become classified documents. Unidentified objects become impossible technology. And once a story reaches that stage, separating evidence from storytelling becomes extremely difficult. But there is something undeniably compelling about the central fact presented by the source: the existence of a hidden underground space connected to a property that was already unusually private. That alone would be enough to make investigators curious. Because when authorities enter a secluded estate after a mysterious death, they don't just examine the bodies. They examine the environment. Every unusual structure becomes a potential clue. Every locked room becomes a question. Every hidden passage becomes a possibility. And this tunnel, whether its origins were mundane or extraordinary, suddenly became part of the final chapter of Gene Hackman's life. Perhaps Hackman knew exactly what was beneath his home. Perhaps he had forgotten about parts of it. Perhaps the tunnel was there long before he arrived. Or perhaps the most important thing was not what the tunnel contained, but why someone had gone to such lengths to hide its entrance. And that is where the mystery truly begins. Because if there really was a hidden chamber beneath the estate, then someone had to know about it. Someone had to maintain it. Someone had to decide whether it should remain sealed. And if Gene Hackman was one of the few people who knew the entire story, his death meant that the person who could explain it was suddenly gone. Investigators were left with only the physical evidence. The walls, the passage, the objects, and the questions. But according to the source, they had not yet reached the most mysterious part of the tunnel. Somewhere deeper underground was a final barrier, one that appeared to have been sealed from the inside. And whatever was behind it could potentially change the entire interpretation of the discovery. Because sometimes the most frightening door isn't the one that hides something from you. It's the one that makes you wonder what was trying to stay hidden. The deeper investigators went into the mystery surrounding Gene Hackman's property, the harder it became to separate what was physically discovered from what people believed those discoveries meant. The hidden passage was already strange enough, but the chamber at the end of it raised an even bigger question. What was the purpose of space like this? According to the source material, investigators reportedly found old crates, photographs, documents, metal objects, and markings inside the underground chamber. Some materials appeared extremely old, while others seemed connected to more modern construction. One of the most unusual claims involved patterns carved into the floor that allegedly resembled astronomical charts. If genuine, such markings could suggest that the chamber had been used for something more than simple storage. But there is an important problem. The available source does not provide independently verified evidence proving that these markings represented secret astronomical knowledge, nor does it establish that the objects were technologically impossible. That leaves us with several possibilities. Perhaps the chamber was created by someone with unusual interests. Perhaps Hackman collected historical objects and documents. Perhaps some of the material came from previous owners. Or perhaps the tunnel itself had a completely ordinary origin that became mysterious because its history was poorly documented. Then comes the location. Hackman's estate was in northern New Mexico, a region deeply connected to American military and scientific history. Los Alamos is nearby, and the surrounding area contains a long history of restricted facilities and underground infrastructure. That fact alone has encouraged speculation that the tunnel could have had some connection to Cold War-era activity. But proximity is not proof. There is currently no established evidence in the source material showing that Gene Hackman's property was connected to a classified government network. Still, one detail remains fascinating: the reported combination of modern reinforcement and older-looking construction. If the tunnel had been modified over decades, it could explain why different sections appeared to belong to different periods. And that would make Hackman's role much more interesting. He may not have created the mystery. He may simply have inherited it. Perhaps he discovered the passage after acquiring the property and decided to keep it private. Perhaps he converted part of it into storage. Perhaps he used it as a secure retreat. Or perhaps he never fully understood its original purpose himself. Then there is the final door. The source describes an iron barrier deep inside the underground chamber, apparently sealed and without an obvious external handle. That sounds dramatic, but a sealed underground door can have many explanations. It could have been part of a bunker, an old utility passage, a reinforced storage area, or a section that had been intentionally closed decades earlier. Without authenticated photographs, engineering reports, or official investigative records, nobody can responsibly say what was behind it. And that may actually be the most important conclusion. The internet wants an answer. People want to hear that investigators discovered something impossible beneath a famous actor's house. But reality is often less cinematic. What we can say is that the story presents a fascinating mystery surrounding a private estate, a secluded final chapter in Hackman's life, and claims of an underground structure whose history remains unclear. And perhaps the strangest part isn't the tunnel itself. It's the timing. Hackman died at the age of 95 after spending years away from the public eye. His wife had died earlier, meaning investigators were reconstructing events without either person available to explain the final days. Whatever secrets existed inside that property, the people who knew the truth were gone. That leaves investigators with physical evidence, and everyone else with questions. Was the underground structure actually connected to Hackman's private life? Was it simply an old feature of the property? Did the chamber contain anything genuinely extraordinary? Or did a mysterious location become the center of a much larger internet legend because of the man's fame? Until verifiable records answer those questions, the most responsible conclusion is also the most intriguing one. The tunnel may be real. The mystery may be real. But the extraordinary explanations remain unproven. And perhaps that's exactly why this story refuses to disappear. Because beneath an ordinary-looking home, there may have been a history nobody fully understood. Gene Hackman spent decades playing characters surrounded by secrets. In the end, his own life became the mystery. And somewhere beneath the property where he lived his final years, an unanswered question may still remain behind a closed door. Not necessarily a conspiracy. Not necessarily a secret government operation. Just a hidden piece of history waiting for someone to determine what it really was. And until that happens, the tunnel beneath Gene Hackman's home remains one of those rare mysteries where the truth could turn out to be stranger than the legend, or far more ordinary. Either way, the question remains, what was really down there?